This week's Parashat contains an episode which is absolutely a nightmare. God instructs Avraham to take his son, his beloved son, Yitzchak, and to offer him up as an offering. And it's at this point that I have a quandary. On the one hand, I can try to explain what it was that God was doing. If I do that, then by definition, when it becomes understandable, the test becomes diminished. On the other hand, the more absurd it is, the more difficult it is, then the greater the action of Avraham. And moreover, if Avram's action is great, then perhaps the merit of his action stand for us, his descendants, today. In the prayers and liturgy, we turn to God, asking to remember the binding of Isaac, to remember the Akaida Yitzchak. So which direction do we go in? Do we defend God? Or do we defend Avraham? So seeking insight into how to resolve this, I asked myself a simple question. What would Avraham do? Wouldn't Avraham do everything in order to serve God? Wouldn't Avraham do everything in order to build up the reputation of God in this world? Wouldn't Avraham sacrifice everything because of his love of God? And if that's the case, then I'm willing to do something which may seem absurd. I'm willing to sacrifice the sacrifice because of love of God. It starts off when it says, Elokim nisa et Avraham, that God tested Avraham. So the first question is, did Avraham realize it was a test? Because when you realize you're being tested, it changes things dramatically. Second point, the name of God which is used here in this section is Elokim. Elokim is the aspect of God which represents judgment. So if Avraham discerns that there's a test, and he realizes it's the aspect of God which is judgment, which is giving the test, then perhaps Avraham plays along, goes along, until the point that it could be determined that he passes the test. But there's another point, and this is far more subtle. And this would require one of two things for this next point to work. Either, and this will sound absurd, that Avraham knows a passage in the Talmud at the very end of the tractate of Masechet Menachot. He knows a teaching there of Ben Azai. Or Avraham, the spiritual genius, understands this teaching intuitively without ever having seen the passage, which is an idea which resonates with me greatly. But as I pointed out, that whenever sacrifices are being called for, wherever the Torah talks about korbanot, the name of God being used is always Yud Hey Vav Hey, the eternal aspect of God, and never Elokim, never God as judge. Because it's not that a sacrifice is a question of giving an offering or a bribe to a judge. It doesn't work that way. You can't bribe God. There's nothing you can do for God. And the one who understands that greater than anyone is most likely Avraham himself. He realizes that there's a God who's outside of nature. Everyone else is worshiping things within nature, and he realizes there's a God outside of nature, and he chooses to worship that God. But once he realizes that God is outside of nature, then by definition, God doesn't have any needs. And if God doesn't have any needs, then a motivation for creation in Avram's mind must be not because God wanted to solve some kind of a problem by virtue of creating, but it was a total act of altruism, an act of kindness, of decency. When Avram understands this, he becomes the greatest person when it comes to decency, kindness, chesed, giving, which means now you understand the test. Avram can easily be somebody who can pass any test based upon chesed. Send Avram 50 guests for Friday night dinner, and he does that with total joy and dedication. But ask him to do something which runs counter to his sense of kindness. That's a test. But Avram loves God, and he's willing to try anything. He's willing to do what God asks him to do, even though it's a total absurdity, because God doesn't need this. God doesn't need offerings. God doesn't need Yitzchak to be offered. And if Avram understands this, then the test just became diminished. And there's one more point. According to our rabbis, Avraham's father once offered him. What do I mean by that? We're told about his father hands Avram over to Nimrod, who throws him into the furnace, but miraculously he's saved from the furnace. If Avraham could be saved from the furnace, then certainly his son Yitzchak could be saved from whatever this test may be. Avram grew up as an idolater, and nonetheless when he found God, he was saved. Yitzchak, who was brought up from the very first days of his life, totally dedicated to this one God, raised with belief, circumcised on the 8th day, brought up by parents who were completely dedicated. This was indeed a test, and if Avram understood that just as he walked out of the furnace, Yitzchak would somehow survive, because God, who's a God of kindness, would not really ask for this. So Avram marches along, prepared for the test. But you realize what we just now did? We sacrificed Avraham's incredible deed and made it somewhat logical, because we also love God. And essentially what we did is exactly what Avram did.